Max Lugavere,
Yo, what up?
welcome in person.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
It's great to see you here in my hometown of Phoenix.
I'm pumped.
You just came from the airport, so thank you for making time.
Yeah, of course.
So you're a health journalist, a New York Times bestselling author. You really got into health when you were, your mom was in her 50s and she developed dementia. Can you tell us a little bit about that process? What drew you to this sort of area of brain health?
Yeah, for sure. So my background is as a generalist journalist. So my first job out of college was working for Al Gore for a TV network in the United States called Current TV that people might remember. It existed between the years of 2005 and 2011 or so. And it was pre-YouTube. So it was really this era where citizen journalism was something that we now take for granted, where people can pick up cameras, and tell important stories in a way that the mainstream media wasn't really doing at the time. So it was an incredible gig. Prior to that, I was actually in college before switching to a double major in film and psychology. I was on a pre-med track. So I'd always been really interested in health science, in nutrition. But I also realized halfway through college that I was a storyteller and that I had this creative spark and that I really wanted to explore that. So I did this, I was on this journalism track for most of my 20s. And I got to work with some of the best in that industry. And this was sort of before journalism today has, I think, lost in many ways its meaning because our, news platforms have become so polarized and so rife with bias. But it meant something back in the day, or at least it meant something to me.
Yeah.
And so that job took me through until, I guess, around my late 20s. And the job had kind of run its course and I was looking for greener pastures professionally. And then around that time in my family life, my mom, who was the most important person in my life, started to display these amorphous symptoms that would take us on essentially a wild goose chase around the northeastern part of the country, to try to understand what it was that she was suffering from. Dementia was not on my radar because she was young, she was in her 50s, she had all the pigment in her hair. And at that time, my maternal grandmother, my mom's mom, was cognitively sharp and she was like 30 years my mom's senior. So that my mom could have like dementia was just not something on our radar at all.
Yeah.
And we were in New York City. We went to all the various hospitals there. I began taking a more active role in trying to understand what was going on with her, again, because I was in between jobs and also because I was a journalist. So I was like kind of an investigator of sorts. And that journey culminated in a trip to the Cleveland Clinic, which is where for the first time my mom was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative condition. It was still unclear at that point, but on that trip was when she was prescribed drugs for both Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And I knew nothing of those two conditions at the time, but that was like an atom bomb going off in my world. I became unable to think about anything else but why this was happening to the person that meant the most to me in the world, the person that I was closest to. And these conditions are terminal, so it was really scary. I essentially, for the first time in my life, at that point, I had a panic attack. And ultimately what that did was it fomented this mission for me to try to understand to the best of my ability. Like, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an academic scientist, but to the best of my ability, why this would have happened to her and how we might do things differently. And that sort of has been the foundational question underlying my books, my podcast, and so I call myself a health and science journalist. I'm very narrowly focused on, nutrition, lifestyle, and, brain health and all of the various variables that fall underneath that bucket. But that's pretty much it. Everything I do kind of like gets filtered through that lens.
Wow. I can only imagine what that would be like. It's sort of like life is so fragile and you never know when a chronic disease can come, right?
Yeah, it's incredibly scary. And it showed me at that point that we're all vulnerable. Ultimately we did a bit of genetic testing and me and my mom are both ApoE4 carriers, heterozygous carriers. We're 3/4s. But, again, my grandmother lived until 96 and was cognitively sharp until the end. She did have a bit of a stroke, like very, very late, to like in the last year of her life, but she lived like very late. And
Yeah.
so the sort of defining question, the defining hypothesis has been for me that something shifted in between my grandmother's generation and my mom's generation. Like, what
Yeah.
was that?
Yeah.
And there are obviously a few, glaring, places to look.
In the
The food-
environment.
yeah, in the environment, the food environment being one of them.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk about brain health. We can get into, I think, a bit more nuance a little bit later. But just to start off, like if you're just getting into this, you really care about. Obviously, everyone cares about their well-being to some extent. But thinking about how do we really enhance our cognition and protect our brain from potential risks of disease, Alzheimer's, dementia.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to kind of like to lay the foundation. What do we know about dementia prevention? This is not a concept that when I first got started was something that you could even talk about without being called fringe or a charlatan,
Quack
or whatever. But as of the past, I would say, since my first book came out, it's been about 6 or 7 years now where that concept has really gained wider acceptance. It began in a really sort of concrete way, I think, with the publication of the 2020 Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, which was then updated in 2024, where it was posited in this sort of consensus paper that 45% of dementia cases are potentially preventable, attributable to what are referred to as modifiable risk factors.
Mm-hmm.
There were a handful of new ones that were added to the 2024 commission paper that were absent the 2020, and I still think that the 2024 is sort of an underestimate, underappreciates certain modifiable risk factors, for example, nutrient deficiencies and overuse of certain over-the-counter drugs like anticholinergic drugs. But nonetheless, we have a bit of a like roadmap at this point, and we can say, almost with certainty that at least 45% of Alzheimer's cases are attributable to modifiable risk factors, which suggests that we can modify our risk, right?
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And importantly, many of those risk factors are responsive to diet. So, I mean, that gives us, I think, a really empowering lens through which to look at food and the choices that we make, 3-4 times a day.
Yeah. So can we get into the specific foods? So what types of foods do we want to prioritize? What types of fats you've mentioned in your writing? And I have to say, so you're not a scientist, so to speak, but I've read your writing and it's very solid. Like I just read you wrote a paper, right, that you submitted to that journal today. And I was kind of like, this is solid work right here. So
Thank you.
you know your stuff. And in general, now, if we're thinking about the foods to prioritize, the nutrients to prioritize, where do we start? What are the key things to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think big picture, we want to think about dietary pattern. And, I very much look up to you and the work that you've put forth. And, now we're sort of at the cusp of the release of the latest dietary guidelines. And so, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but dietary pattern matters a lot. And so we want to prioritize whole foods as much as we possibly can. When I first started writing the book, Genius Foods, my first book, I'm not trying to promote it or anything, but the term ultra-processed foods hadn't really yet reached critical mass in terms of like widespread adoption. You might have been familiar with it, but it was not really something that most people were talking about. We talked about junk foods, we talked about frankenfoods and things like that. But that concept of like ultra-processed foods and the fact that American diets are now dominated by these kinds of packaged, shelf-stable, nutrient-depleted, hyper-palatable, ultra-calorie dense foods wasn't really yet in the public zeitgeist the way it is now. Nonetheless, we pointed to the fact that most people overconsume these foods. There's this phenomena. This is pre the Kevin Hall study, by the way.
Which came out in 2019.
Yeah,
the next year.
But in Genius Foods, me and my co-author, we talked a lot about the fact that there are certain foods in the food environment that are manufactured in big plants that tend to have this characteristic known as hyperpalatability. They typically are very calorie dense. They tend to be nutrient depleted. And this is one of the reasons why most people have at least one nutrient deficiency, which is something that you talked about the last time that you were on my podcast, is, your domain of expertise. And so we want to really move away from an ultra-processed dietary pattern towards one that is predominantly whole foods.
Right.
And we didn't yet, when I published my first book, have the data linking ultra-processed food consumption directly to dementia risk, but now we do. So now we have a slew of studies. There was one that came out which found that for every 10%, I think it was NHANES, I don't remember off the top of my head, but found that for every 10% increase in ultra-processed foods consumed, we see 25% increase in relative risk for the diagnosis of dementia. And then there's another study as well that further, solidified that observation. So
Right.
yeah, so these foods are, I think, they're not good for us from the standpoint of metabolic health, and the brain sits directly downwind of the consequences of metabolic illness.
Yeah. And depression as well. I think in these later studies now, you can find just about any study on any sort of outcome linking ultra-processed foods to diabetes, heart disease, depression, right? Cancer,
Yeah,
Alzheimer's.
100%. Yeah, there was that updated review and umbrella meta-analysis that found, that linked 32 negative health outcomes. Pretty much every
Right.
every negative health outcome you could imagine is now being linked to the excessive consumption of ultra-processed foods. Not one positive health outcome was linked to the chronic consumption of ultra-processed foods.
Right.
And, I don't believe that all ultra-processed foods are bad. I'm not an absolutist. I consume ultra-processed foods. I try to, prioritize those that are protein enriched. I think that there's benefit there. There's, I think, probably benefits to the fiber enrichment of ultra-processed foods and the like. But when you zoom out, it's sort of like BMI. Like BMI is an imperfect diagnostic tool, but it's a pretty reliable screening tool,
Right.
especially at the population level.
Yeah.
So too, I think, is the ultra-processed food designation. Like, if it's something that can be sold in a vending machine, chances are it's not the best choice.
And you're saying it's a dietary pattern, because if you have an ultra-processed food every once in a while, that's totally different than your diet is 60% of calories, right?
Exactly.
So big picture, whole foods, minimally processed foods, cut out or reduce, limit these ultra-processed foods. Now, specific foods, we hear a lot about, fatty fish, right? Long-chain omega-3s. I think one thing that you have really dug into, which I find really fascinating with my work, when I look at nutrient deficiencies around the world, we find really high levels in poor countries, right? They don't have access to diverse diets. We also find a lot of deficiencies in the US, right? We see vitamin D deficiency. We see iron deficiency, especially in women, right? We see calcium issues. We see vitamin E, magnesium, potassium. So usually we think of these as diseases of undernutrition where you have wasting or stunting, right? You're not growing, you have anemia. But you've done a lot of kind of exploring how do they affect cognitive functioning? How do they affect your health, your brain in later life? So can you talk about what is the role of these nutrients play in protecting the brain against dementia and other illnesses?
Yeah. So, I think the brain requires, at the most basic level, the brain requires omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. We tend to be omega-6 replete thanks to the standard American diet. And also, even looking outside of the context of ultra-processed foods and the notorious seed oils, which are rich in an omega-6 fat called linoleic acid. Very healthy foods like nuts and seeds, which are pretty easy to access, are replete with omega-6 fatty acids. So we tend not to need to worry about getting hitting the adequate intake for omega-6s. But yeah, omega-3s, like, people tend to underconsume. I believe 80% of Americans don't consume, the adequate amount of omega-3s, which is like, we don't really have like a set target for that at this juncture, but generally, like, they're based on whatever guidelines you choose to look at. Generally it's around like 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish a week. Or 1 to 2 grams of combined EPA and DHA per day.
And the thing is that these long chain fats you're talking about, sort of the EPA and the DHA, they're really only available in animal source foods, except for certain types of algae that can be processed into supplements. And I think one thing people don't always recognize is that the plant sources, those nuts and the seeds, super healthy, right? Very nutritious, but they don't contain the same form of the omega-3, and the conversion is very poor. So, I mean, at best, you're going to get a 10-to-1 ratio. So you have to consume 10 times as much, right?
Yeah.
So it's another reason why the recommendation isn't necessarily just to consume omega-3s from plant sources, but it's specifically the fatty fish, right?
Yeah, and there is individual difference in terms of the efficiency, the capacity for which people can effectively elongate the short chain omega-3s like alpha-linolenic acid and convert them to their usable forms in the body, icosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, or EPA and DHA. That varies person to person. It varies based on genetics. It varies based on gender. It varies based on dietary context. So if you're consuming a lot of linoleic acid, I mean, you're essentially handicapping your body's ability to the enzymes involved in that elongation process. I believe they're like the delta 5 and delta 6 desaturase enzymes. The fatty acids that you consume compete for their use.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only so much to go around. And so if you're over consuming linoleic acid, which most people are, then you're handicapping your body's ability to convert alpha-linolenic acid to EPA and DHA. So that's a lot of like biochemistry, and it's been a minute since I've reviewed that stuff.
But the big picture is it's like you don't want to risk it. Like the conversion is already just the average being 10 and 10-to-1 at best. It's really not something you really want to risk. So I think that's
exactly.
And like you said, like the form with these, we don't have to get into the seed oil debate, right? The seed oils that we consume that are in all of the foods, the processed, ultra processed foods that we eat, we've seen the trends like skyrocket, right? And with that is sort of this really high increase of the omega-6, which is not it's an essential fat. We need it, right? It's just that the ratio is very high, right? We see 10-to-1, 20-to-1 compared to maybe more traditional diets being closer to 2-to-1 or even 1-to-1, right? So I think what you're saying is just like kind of emphasizing the omega-3. And in the nuts and seeds, there's these natural sources of omega-6. And you're also getting the fiber and you're getting polyphenols and all sorts of things with that, right?
Yeah, and you're getting the fat-soluble antioxidants that protect those fats, like vitamin E.
That's right.
Right.
And you've talked about vitamin E playing a role in brain health as well. Antioxidants, polyphenols, you've talked about anthocyanins, you've talked about a lot of different nutrients and phytonutrients. Can you tell us more about some creatine from animal sources? I just love to highlight plants, animals, unique compounds, they're both great.
Yeah, they're both great. They're both great. I think I sometimes, because, the nutrition space has become so polarized, and, I'm a bit of a personality on social media, I will concede. So I get sometimes pigeonholed as like, a pro-carnivore advocate by some. I think most people who've paid any attention to my work, you look on the cover of my book, like it's, there are more plants than there are animal source foods.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always been a strong advocate for the consumption of both. In fact, I was very early to evangelizing the value of carotenoids, for example, which I think are really beneficial from the standpoint of brain health. Research has only come out since my first book supporting that carotenoids like lutein and zeaxanthin are crucially important when it comes to protecting the brain and your neuronal cell membranes from oxidative stress. And the brain is a crucible for oxidative stress. It's like your brain is the size of a grapefruit. It makes up 2 to 3% of your body's mass, and yet it accounts for 25% of the oxygen metabolism in your body. So it's like all of this oxygen metabolism is occurring in this really tight container. And so that's why I think it's perfectly plausible that the consumption of carotenoids and other fat-soluble antioxidants from the diet, like vitamin E, are going to be related, over time to better brain health.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in fact, is actually what was found via the late, great Martha Claire Morris's work, who pioneered the MIND diet. She found that vitamin E is really the only, fat-soluble vitamin, essential nutrient that's directly related, has an inverse relationship to dementia risk.
Yeah.
But then, of course, carotenoids, there's mounting evidence on the value of carotenoids as well. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago that found that brains with Alzheimer's disease had about 50% of the levels of, I believe it was lutein and zeaxanthin. It could have been both, so don't quote me on this, but in that category of lutein and zeaxanthin, there were about half of the levels of these carotenoids in the Alzheimer's brain as compared to a healthy brain.
Wow.
So carotenoids are incredibly valuable. And then anthocyanins are wonderful compounds. They're the pigment that give blueberries their beautiful blue hue, also present in red onions and purple potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
And I became friendly with a researcher who does a lot of work, some of which is funded by, the Berry Board or whatever, but such as nutrition science. And he's done a lot of the work on looking at berry extracts in the context of cognitive health. And his name is Dr. Robert Krikorian. And blueberry anthocyanins seem to be really beneficial. In fact, the Mind Diet also only made the recommendation when it came to fruit. It was kind of funny that it only made the recommendation for berries.
Oh, really?
And I believe blueberries specifically. Yeah, it doesn't make like a blanket fruit recommendation. It's just like eat berries.
Have you noticed the color difference between regular blueberries and wild blueberries?
They're much darker, right?
The wild blueberry is very rich because they haven't been sort of bred to be sweeter and sweeter. They have a lot more of the skin, which is that purple. And then the purple sweet potatoes, which I love too.
Yeah, the anthocyanins actually, polyphenols, many plant compounds actually, interestingly, are not all that bioavailable. So like everybody loves to talk about turmeric and curcumin, but the bioavailability of these compounds is very poor. Some of the benefit, the proposed benefit of many of these compounds is actually now being rethought to consider the microbiome, that some of the benefit derived from eating a diverse array of whole plants is actually through the postbiotic compounds that come of the fermentation of the polyphenols that many of them contain. But pigments are unique in that they are bioavailable, like carotenoids and also anthocyanins. Anthocyanins, I believe, have been shown to actually accumulate in the brain, so they make your brain kind of blue. And yeah, they seem to promote memory function, reduce oxidative stress, and the like. They're just very powerful antioxidants that have this preferential affinity for the brain.
Wow. And I think it's also telling that we often we'll get some new evidence about a particular type of food, nutrient, compound, something, right? And there's thousands of these compounds. And so it could be that there's a reason to consume different diverse fruits, vegetables, animal source foods that we don't know about yet. So there is this sort of aspect that I think of as diversity as sort of a way to protect and to have the most confidence that you're getting a lot of these compounds, and the focus on nutrient density, like you've mentioned before too. It's not just to get your nutrient needs met, which is important, but it's like there's other potential beneficial aspects of these nutrients, even the non-essential nutrients, like you're talking about polyphenols, creatine. Have you talked about creatine yet? I mean, creatine.
Yeah, no, creatine's amazing. And it's actually a term that I've been using that I got from your podcast is the dark matter of foods. And I think it's like such a beautiful, elegant, wonderful, like way to think about food and the miraculous nature of our symbiosis with the foods that we're eating. That there are myriad, innumerable compounds in food that have yet to be studied, right? Because like Berry Board or what have you haven't decided to fund those studies, but there's like innumerable. And that's why I think therein lies the magic of eating primarily whole foods. Conversely, there's a dark matter in ultra-processed foods. There are the macros that you read on the nutrition facts label and the ingredients that you see on the ingredients list, but there's also, endocrine disrupting compounds now that are being identified in ultra-processed foods and the like. So we really have to consider, the whole food matrix or even the ultra-processed food matrix when making dietary decisions.
Yeah, it all matters. Okay. And you've been your book came out in 2018, the first one, right? So you've been researching the brain health thing for a long time. So I'm curious to know what you've been like looking into now. What is the latest thing that you sort of learned that you're excited about?
Well, creatine's very exciting. And I know everybody is now talking about creatine, but I actually wrote my high school senior thesis on creatine more than 20 years ago.
No.
Yeah. So this was the year I graduated in 2000, and I wrote a 10-page paper on creatine monohydrate. Because I was like really early, I was a bodybuilding enthusiast like in high school. I just gravitated to that science, that world, and I was taking creatine back then. But now everybody's talking about it through the lens of cognition, and I think that it's just super cool to see the research on, for example, there was one pilot study that was published recently in patients with Alzheimer's disease. It was a small study, fairly short term. There was no placebo group, so there were significant limitations. But nonetheless, in the field of Alzheimer's disease, there are precious few therapies that actually work, that actually move the needle. And so, in this pilot study, they found that across every cognitive domain measured, there was an improvement in cognitive function from patients with Alzheimer's disease who were taking it was about 20 grams of creatine a day.
Wow.
So that's a very high dose. We don't yet know if a lower dose will move the needle. I mean, it's sort of like how this usually works is that researchers will pick a high dose to see if there's an effect, and then try to whittle it down to see what the minimum effective dose is. But
how much meat would you have to consume? Like
a lot,
2 or 3 pounds?
Yeah,
more.
A lot of meat. A lot of meat. Yeah, Sean Baker, very happy.
Gets close to that.
Yeah, gets close to that.
Naturally, yeah.
Yeah, he's the only one. But no, it's super cool because I've taken flack for promoting red meat, which I came at this with no preconceptions about, what the nutrition establishment deems bad. But I did grow up, with the iconic, the now retired food pyramid. And, in my kitchen growing up, we never used butter, only margarine. We had corn oil by the stove. And my mom was always very afraid of heart disease. And so I grew up constantly hearing about, the dietary recommendations of the day, which were to minimize your consumption of saturated fat and dietary cholesterol. And that always struck me as being really odd. I mean, like in a world where so many people their diets are dominated by ultra-processed foods, to demonize any whole food.
Or refined grains, which were one of the primary sources of calories in our diet, right?
Exactly. So, I've always gone to bat for red meat. And the fact that there are so many, important nutrients in it from the standpoint of brain health, to me, it doesn't really seem like much of a coincidence. It's a great source of protein. I'm not, I've never really been all that concerned about the saturated fat in red meat, but with the caveat, with the asterisk, that I've never been a big advocate for chasing saturated fat either, because, when you feed a cow its biologically appropriate diet, which is grass, it has lower levels of saturated fat. So to me, that was just a very logical, indicator that we're not meant to overconsume saturated fat. When you feed an animal what it's meant to consume, it has lower levels of saturated fat in it.
Not to mention, I just spoke with Herman Poncer yesterday, and he's this evolutionary anthropologist, right? He lived with the Hadza. He studied them for a long time. And he, studied these warm weather climate hunter-gatherers. The wild foods that they ate were very low in saturated fat. It's not to say saturated fat in natural foods today is harmful, but like the sort of evolutionary diet was these lean, wild game animals, right? And there wasn't a lot of, you're not getting fed, fattened up at the feedlot with all this corn and other grains. And that I think people think of sort of the normal meat that we get today, very, very fatty. It's not necessarily like the type of meat that we've eaten for a long time,
Exactly, yeah. And I think the observational data on saturated fat intake, it's confounded because, when associated with human health outcomes, I mean, the majority of saturated fat, it's just very noisy. It's like very noisy data because the majority of saturated fat that Americans consume comes from mixed dishes, pizza, burritos, chicken nuggets, tacos, lasagna, things like that, right? Only 3% of the saturated fat that your average American consumes comes from unprocessed red meat, excluding mixed dishes, which I think is like a significant data point. And then of the saturated fat that Americans consume, much of it comes from dairy. Now, dairy is interesting because, butter is kind of unique in the canon of dairy options available to, people today. Dairy fat tends to be bound by what's called milk fat globule membrane, which is what, dairy, like milk is mostly water, right? So dairy has its own sort of lipoprotein to keep the fat suspended in water. And that's why, when you pour a glass of milk, the fat in milk doesn't rise to the top. It's bound by what's called milk fat globule membrane. And it seems to be the case that dairy fat, excluding butter and butter derivatives like ghee, is neutral and maybe even beneficial from the standpoint of lipids, right? But that's where dairy is where most of the saturated fat that Americans consume comes from. Now, butter is a little different. I think there's healthy user bias involved there when people consume a lot of butter, because butter has been, we've been told for decades to, that butter's not good for us, right? To reach for margarine instead. And I don't think that butter is necessarily a health food because it is unique. It does actually raise, lipids like LDL cholesterol and ApoB.
Yeah. And I think the whole food sources really is the focus in terms of what we should be worried about. Not worried about, what we should be paying attention to, right? Because I think the added fats, there's not a lot of particular benefit of having a lot of refined fats.
Correct.
Right? It's like, but the whole food source is the dairy source. The milk fat globule membrane that you mentioned is actually more present in whole dairy products than it is in butter, and even less so in butter oil, which is sometimes used in like the highly processed foods, right? So it just kind of goes along with the same. It's sort of common sense at this point that the more you refine these foods, the more potential risk there can be, right? It's not always the case, but that's a general theme, I think. So
100%. And I've always said that you overfeed any nutrient and bad things will happen. So, I mean, you overfeed saturated fat. Yeah, of course, bad things will happen. You overfeed calories, bad things will happen. You overfeed fructose, bad things will happen. The goal should be not to overfeed.
Yeah. And it's also varies depending on the person. For me, saturated fat doesn't really raise my LDL cholesterol very much compared to other foods. But for some people it does, right? So it matters depending on who you are. Okay, so is there anything you've changed your mind about? Anything you can sort of admit like you were wrong and now you think differently?
For sure. My journey in this space has been purely a good faith investigation to try to understand to the best of my ability, the truth about nutrition. And I've always tried to be as rigorous as possible, given my non-academic background, and to try to align myself with people who I found to be really brilliant in the space. I became aware of, a neurologist who's been a really early mentor of mine who really did a lot of work to usher in this idea of preventative neurology, Dr. Richard Isaacson. I got to co-author a paper with him a couple of years ago. And so, of course, I mean, the science evolves. I think one of the major areas where I've changed my thinking was early on, I was seduced by, I think, many that bought into the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And I think it made a lot more, it was more plausible at the time. This was pre a lot of the metabolic ward studies that Kevin Hall, led and others, and the real focus on ultra processed foods as being a major driver of, excessive energy intake. And so I put a lot of emphasis on carbohydrates, and then I related it maybe at times overzealously to brain health. Right. But now I really see, which isn't to say that there isn't the possible utility of a ketogenic diet in, for patients struggling with Alzheimer's disease. We need a lot more research on that. But there is some research looking at ketogenic therapies for patients with Alzheimer's disease, and I wish we had more. But that has been a gold standard therapy for certain kinds of epilepsy for a century at this point. And so, I don't want to throw the ketogenic line of research under the bus at all. But now from the standpoint of prevention, my focus has really kind of been honed more specifically to energy excess and the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods, what drives the chronic overconsumption of calories today. And so for that reason, I don't think that there's obviously nothing inherently fattening or obesogenic or diabetogenic about carbohydrates. It's about the dietary pattern. It's about, energy balance. And so, and I've also taken a bit more of the role of, muscle health and body composition have become increasingly important to me. And I've become increasingly well-versed in the literature on body composition. And, I've even sort of brought into my understanding of how to nudge body composition to a healthier direction, some of the research on like bodybuilding. And I have a bias, I guess. I've always been really interested in body composition and bodybuilding and the like. But, if you look at any natural bodybuilder, like they're eating like lots of carbohydrates. So it's very obvious to me that carbohydrates are not inherently fattening, and in fact can be used to achieve a leaner, stronger body. I mean, you look at any science loves its silos, and so there is I attribute my non-academic background, my more creative way of thinking, to being able to connect dots that some might not be able to see, and see patterns where some might not be able to see. But you look at any bodybuilder on prep and their what I eat in a day diets on YouTube, and there's more white rice than a Chinese restaurant. So this idea that carbohydrates are inherently fattening or are inherently promotive of insulin resistance, which is something that I might have actually suggested in my first book, Genius Foods, I no longer believe to be the case.
Yeah, and I think that's also fascinating when you look at the evolutionary perspective. There are examples of all different combinations of the amount of carbohydrates, the amount of animal source foods and whatnot. And you have examples of hunter-gatherers that are consuming a lot of roots and tubers, a lot of plantains, a lot of these kind of natural sources, right? We don't necessarily have examples of a bunch of refined grain products, right? That's a bit different, especially when you combine it with the refined fats and oils and starch and sugar and salt, and then you have these kind of hyper-palatable foods. But yeah, I appreciate that. I'm a researcher, and I'm obviously doing a bit more communication about science, and I've had papers where I completely have to, I made an error and I have to do a correction, and I'm sort of oh gosh, I messed that up, or I do a post and I'm kind of called out by people, and so that happens, and I think it's just part of the game. I think it's important that we can also, not just when we make mistakes or we don't know something, but like you said, the science evolves a lot. So I've changed my views on things as evidence has come. I mean, you have to, because science is just scratching the surface with most of these things, right? And it's always evolving.
100%. Yeah. I mean, maintaining insulin sensitivity is really important from the standpoint of brain health. So at the time, I might have put too much emphasis on, carbohydrate intake as a mediator of as a direct mediator of insulin sensitivity, or conversely resistance. But now my understanding is that, you become insulin resistant when you become overfat, and everybody has a personal fat threshold. And once you start spilling over fat into your organs, your liver, your pancreas, that's when insulin resistance develops. And it doesn't matter if you're over-consuming carbohydrates, if you're over-consuming fat, if you're over-consuming energy, your body's going to store that energy. And once it runs out of quote unquote professional sites of storage, like your adipocytes, then it's going to start stuffing that fat in places where fat shouldn't be stuffed, like your liver, your pancreas. And so I think, it ultimately comes down to energy balance, and what is driving the chronic overconsumption of energy in the modern food environment. It's ultra-processed foods. I also think that there's something to be said for mixed dishes themselves, which are not necessarily ultra-processed foods, but they're foods that combine various macronutrients and textures and flavors in ways that just push your brain to a bliss point beyond which self-control is impossible. So, I mean, this is something that I'm thinking more and more about these days. Like a food like one of my favorite foods, chicken tikka masala. Okay? It's not an ultra-processed food, but it's a lot different from the chicken, the rice, and the broccoli that, defines like a bodybuilder's diet, right? Bodybuilders have become increasingly good at optimizing for satiety and keeping their food enjoyable while reducing the reward value, like reducing the hedonic quality of their food, right? So I think there is some success leaves clues, right? So there is something to be said for separating your starches from your protein, from your fiber, and not using a bunch of creamy or added, oily sauces and dumped on top of the starch, right? So I'm thinking more and more about these days what I call combination foods, or you might call mixed dishes, foods that are not necessarily ultra processed but still drive you to overeat. The pad thai, the chicken tikka masala, even chips and guac, an acai bowl. Avocado toast. Every modern food has become a combination food of sorts. And I think that there's some sort of underappreciated aspect to those completely unintentional, accidental combinations that drive people to overeat.
Yeah. I'm thinking, when you're talking about this, I'm thinking about Thanksgiving, because if you have turkey and you have to have a potato and you have some vegetables, pretty satiating foods. But if there's any meal that I overeat, it's Thanksgiving. I combine the mashed potatoes with the gravy and the turkey and everything else, and it's like I could eat probably 4,000 or 5,000 calories for that single meal, right?
100%, yeah. And what's I think fascinating is that we're not talking about ultra processed foods, but the sensation from the standpoint of the brain is not all that dissimilar from the sensation that we get from ultra processed foods. I think we probably need more research there, but from a reward standpoint, again, like there's something to be said for separating your foods out, the way that bodybuilders typically will do it, and yeah, I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, we've talked a lot about food, diet. That's obviously important. On your podcast, The Genius Life, you cover sleep, you cover exercise, you cover stress management, the environment. Can you talk just at a high level, what is sort of the main things that you pay attention to really have overall wellness?
Yeah, I mean, I think exercise is really crucially important. I personally, like, I have a bias for resistance training. I'm just really into it. I'm also not an athlete. Like, I am just fascinated by the body's response, the adaptive response to lifting weights. I've seen this in terms of my own body, my own health, and I think that resistance training is really crucial from a standpoint of metabolic health. And again, the brain, there's evidence linking insulin resistance in the body to what's called glucose hypometabolism in the brain. And this is something that is starkly observable in Alzheimer's disease. The brain's ability to generate ATP from glucose is diminished by about 50%. And the degree of hypometabolism in the brain is strongly correlated to the degree of insulin resistance in the body. There's even a researcher named Suzanne de la Monte, who I featured in my documentary, who coined the term type 3 diabetes to describe the impaired energetics that are occurring in the demented brain.
Right.
And it seems to be the case that by keeping the body as insulin sensitive as possible, that goes a long way towards preserving brain health long term. And so I think resistance training is like really beneficial from the standpoint of metabolic health. I'm not a huge cardio junkie. I think, obviously HRV, VO2 max, all super important. But, I think ultimately you have to meet people where they're at, and making a bunch of like sweeping generalizations about people and, how they should approach their fitness, I don't know if that's necessarily helpful. I always think about like somebody like my mom listening on the other end. You have to do what's going to be the most enjoyable for you to do when it comes to exercise. And for me, it's resistance training. And then walking. Like, I just try to walk as much as I can. I think walking, there are outsized benefits to walking, given how, not sensational walking is. The benefits, I think, are really quite incredible from a, glucose regulation standpoint. Walking literally pumps fresh blood up to the brain, whereas being sedentary for an extended period of time drains the brain of blood.
There was a new study I just saw came out on like walking was like, I think the top sort of thing, lifestyle characteristic that was good for health. It was one of the top, right? It was one of the top ones.
Yeah, where it can scale endlessly. Like there's no upper limit seemingly to the amount that you can walk and derive benefit from, because it doesn't really build fatigue. It doesn't really build hunger. It's low impact. It doesn't impede recovery. And so, it's almost like this magical activity.
I think there's something with the brain too with walking. There's this, in therapy, there's this EMDR, eye movement rapid desensitization, right? Or desensitization, whatever, reprocessing.
Yeah.
So this thing can kind of help people process through trauma and stuff. But one of the key aspects of it is you have this sort of bilateral stimulation. So it's either with buzzers or you can tap on somebody's knees. And so walking can subtly, just the left, right, the bilateral consistent pattern, I think that's part of like why walking can be good. Now, I don't know all the evidence for it, but that makes sense to me too.
That's fascinating. I never I've never heard that. I've never thought of it that way, but it's going to make my therapist really happy to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, and I try to walk when I'm on meetings. I'll be looking at like a spreadsheet, and I'll be walking in the neighborhood, and you can see like I stand where I try to move because like we're sitting now. And when I sit for like more than a half an hour to an hour, I can kind of feel like I feel lethargic. I feel kind of achy. You know, when you stand up and you kind of have to stretch. And so like when I stand, I kind of try to move a lot where I just lean on one leg and kind of put my leg up and move. And then when I walk away from the desk, I could just do anything. I don't feel like I need to do that stretch. So I feel like that too. Like it's just the walking sort of thing for me it's something that I feel is one of the biggest aspects of my health, of just like overall health. Yeah.
It's huge. Yeah. I mean, I feel way better on days that I'm getting that, 10,000 steps, which is not, it's 10,000 steps is oddly non-scientific for how popular of a target it's become. But there is data showing that more is essentially better.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I feel way better on days that I'm walking more. I've become like really interested in, I think a really important variable for most people when it comes to like longevity and wellness is just finding ways to increase movement in your day.
Yeah.
I think resistance training is very valuable, but we've outsourced so much of our movement today. I mean, I joked recently on a podcast, like I don't have to get off my couch to adjust my thermostat anymore. I can do it from my phone. I mean, even when I brush my teeth, my toothbrush now vibrates for me in case of brushing my teeth myself, right? It was like too much work.
Yeah.
We've just gotten so good at wringing even basic movements out of our day. And that's a huge part of the energy outside of the equation, right? The calories in, calories out equation that dictates in no small part body composition for so many of us. Like the energy out has just completely, it's all but vanished. And so doing what you can to move more over the course of the day, whether it's like parking further from the entrance of the store, I mean, I don't even know. Like even cooking food, like we don't cook our food anymore. We order food with our apps and it arrives cooked for us to our doorsteps.
Yeah. I just love the audio. I know not everybody is an audio person, but like listening to audiobooks or podcasts for me is just critical. Like I look at a computer all day. I don't want to read another book and just like lay down motionless, right? Like I want to be able to be doing chores or walking around and having like some movement when I do that. So yeah, I fully agree.
Yeah. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. I mean, cleaning the house, chores around the house, self-care, singing, dancing, like all of these. Mm-hmm. There's research that shows that, I mean, people have total daily energy expenditure is like the biggest variable when it comes to a person's total daily energy expenditure is NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So these are all of the, I mean, non-conscious movements, right? Like fidgeting, but then also conscious movements like walking, which, is an activity that isn't deliberate exercise. But in people who are very active can make up a huge proportion of their total daily energy expenditure. Yeah. But for people who are just sedentary all day, it makes up a tiny proportion.
Right.
And that's like, that swing is massive. And I think for many people, like in the context of the modern milieu where even basic movement has essentially vanished, I mean, that right there is enough to explain, I think, the obesity epidemic. And then you throw the fact that ultra processed foods are constantly at arm's reach today, intensively marketed. I mean, it's just like throwing fuel on the fire.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think the cooking aspect of things is key for the diet, because when we don't prepare our food, we don't get to choose what goes into it. We're usually not invested in what's into it, and we're eating on the go. We're not, maybe we're not having sort of more community. I mean, we're eating at our desk, right? As opposed to like sharing a meal with people and whatnot. And you've done a lot of cooking, and your book, what's the book called? It's
Genius Kitchen.
Yeah. I remember I saw the cover of that and I was like, that looks good. I mean, it was a mix. I think there was some lean red meat in there, but there's a bunch of vegetables, right? Diverse color. And I know you really enjoy cooking. Can you, for people who it's a little bit intimidating, right? Like I think we as a society have gotten away from that where for many people it's just, I don't have time. It's too much work. How do I know what to buy? How do I know what works together, right? Do you have examples or any tips?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think you really want to prioritize recipes that are simple and prioritize few but high quality ingredients. Um, the most commonly used spices in my kitchen are salt, pepper, and maybe garlic powder. I mean, you could take almost any vegetable and use a little bit of extra virgin olive oil, sprinkle some salt, pepper, and garlic on it, and make it totally delicious. There's also now you have cooking sprays, like extra virgin olive oil based cooking sprays. So you don't even have to add a lot of fat to make vegetables totally delicious. I think people just need to, not try to bite off more than they can chew. It's always fun to cook to try your hand at a complicated recipe, and I've got plenty of them, in that book. But the vast majority of meals that I'm consuming are meals that can be cooked using just a small handful. Like I can count on less than one hand the number of ingredients. So focusing on ingredient quality and making sure that your kitchen is always stocked with those, I think really goes a long way. With meat, for example, with like steak, all you need is salt and maybe pepper. You don't even need that. And you can cook something really quite delicious. I think the biggest barrier for most people when it comes to getting healthy is friction. It's either too much friction when it comes to cooking healthy whole foods. They try to, they overthink things. They try to, cook endlessly complex recipes. Or it's too little friction when it comes to reaching for ultra processed foods. So I think thinking in terms of friction and increasing the friction when it comes to reaching for, your trigger foods, maybe not allowing them in the house, maybe, not keeping them always, within like visible range, right? Like keeping them tucked away in cabinets. That's a way to increase friction, using a food scale to measure portion sizes, like a digital food scale. Just keeping just having a digital food scale, which is, by the way, one of the lowest cost biohacking devices that I think has the most outsized wins when it comes to benefits. Just reducing the friction to using it by keeping it out all the time. Like my food scale is out all the time in my kitchen, and I use it constantly throughout the day. Why? Not because I'm necessarily tracking things, but it's because it increases the friction that I'm going to eat 2 servings when I only intend on consuming 1 serving.
You're more mindful about it too. You have to be intentional, right?
It brings accountability. It brings awareness. It brings... I've been looking at some of these meta-analyses on what it is about long-term weight loss sustainers that makes them successful, right? And it's accountability. It's self-assessment. It's like, it's awareness. It's bringing awareness to what it is that you're eating. And by having that food scale out constantly, man, it's one of the big wins. So I think thinking in terms of friction, like how can you reduce the friction to cooking more? It's not trying to cook recipes that involve a bajillion, exotic ingredients.
Yeah.
It's like getting good at cooking a steak, which requires 2 ingredients. It's getting good at, nailing down just making white rice, which can be incredibly tasty with just a little bit of like added salt,
Yeah. I'm feeling a little bit better about myself because I think I use extra virgin olive oil, salt, and pepper for everything. And it's like, I'll sometimes just salt, right? Like I'll do asparagus, a little bit of oil just in the air fryer or something, or roasted baked potato or, sweet potato, something like that. And then meat. I kind of, as you were saying, it doesn't take a lot to make a steak taste good. I think about like tofu. I'm like, it kind of takes a lot to make tofu taste good. But the way I think of it is if the food is naturally a fresh, ripe, in season something, it has so much flavor already, right? Like you're sort of letting the flavor of the food itself come through as opposed to covering it up, right? And people say, I don't like the taste of fish. They're like, well, you have to try to cover it up, right? But it's like salmon, I'll do salt and pepper, or trout or something, right? It's just salt and pepper. It tastes amazing. A steak, it tastes amazing. Even these vegetables, right? If they're just cooked to the right, there's this simplicity of that. I think for busy people who don't have the time, or I think it's not even just time, it's the mental energy. Like when I had kids, so before I had kids, I was more experimental. I remember cooking some Thai dishes, some interesting soups, all sorts of stuff. And the second I got kids, I sort of didn't have the mental capacity to do that. I was just like, I just need to get some basic good ingredients here and put salt and pepper on them and cook them the right way, right? Even a roast. If I think about like doing a roast in the oven, I literally just add salt and pepper, and with the fat, like you cook it for 3.5 hours, like convection roast, low temperature. I've had people that always ask, they're like, "What did you do to that? What did you put in that?" Or the chicken that I roast. I'm like, salt and pepper. That's it.
That's it. Yeah, I like to think in terms of like how to create a Mediterranean style kitchen. I also am very sensitive to aesthetics. I like there to be just a minimalist vibe in my kitchen. Like, and I like to have my favorite ingredients out, like on the counter. Like I buy, this is going to sound really bougie, but you don't have to do what I do necessarily in this regard. But I like to buy like, if I see spices that come in a really nice bottle, like the bottle is attractive.
Yeah.
I'll keep it out. Like I don't put it away in some like spice drawer somewhere. Like I keep them out on my counter at all times. And that also has the effect, not only does it like actually look nice and it feels like a warm, inviting Mediterranean style kitchen, but it reduces the friction for me to actually use them.
Yeah. It's right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk just before we finish. I know you've given us a lot of your time, and this film, Little Empty Boxes. I watched the trailer. I almost started crying just watching the trailer, and when I was an undergraduate, the movie is about your mom, right? The story, kind of the journey of your mom. I was in a psychology class. I was a psychology minor. One of my teachers studied adult caregivers of parents with dementia. So I had to write a 25-page research paper, and I just like my mind was sort of blown by what people go through, can go through. It's all different for everyone when that happens, right? And my grandma died from dementia, but she had sort of like the best. I mean, I could just compare to some of the stories I've heard. One of the like most peaceful experiences, she would say, like, "Which one are you again?" And she just sort of peaceful, right? She didn't, and she died in her sleep. And then I've read so many more challenging stories. I just like, I think that film, like, I'm intrigued and I want to watch it, but I'm also like, this is intense. Like, this is like, can you tell us, for people who aren't familiar maybe with what this is about, can you give a little bit of an overview, just sort of telling us and what you wanted to accomplish with that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Little Empty Boxes is my first project, like in this space. This was me coming out of that gig hosting this TV network where I was a journalist. Like, this was my first project to, on the one hand, memorialize what it was that my mom was going through, which was unprecedented for me, in the scope of my family. I wanted to pay homage to my mom. And this, I studied film in college, so this wasn't from like out of nowhere. This was something that, I was a filmmaker. And I've always been really interested in self-documentation, which now sounds trite because we live in the era of the selfie and the Instagram influencer, but this is like well before Instagram. I've just really, when I was in college, I kind of fell in love with the idea of, using film as a medium to immortalize what would otherwise be just like a fleeting, albeit precious moment, life is full of moments that are all too fleeting. And I saw film at the time, documentary filmmaking specifically because of their immediacy, as a way to immortalize like life in a way, because life can be so fleeting and we don't know how long we've got. And this was at a time when cell phones, or not even cell phones, point and shoot cameras had become cheap enough and just good enough when it came to recording video that like you could actually like create video with a device that could fit in your pocket. I mean, I sound like a dinosaur, but it doesn't seem that long ago, pre-iPhone. And so I was in love with this idea. So when my mom became sick, intuitively as an artist, I felt this instinct to immortalize what she was going through, and to try to in some way turn what was really deeply painful into something that was meaningful. And on top of that, from a professional standpoint or from a journalistic standpoint, I saw it as an opportunity to get to use it as a calling card to reach out to researchers to learn more about what the hell my mom was going through.
Yeah.
Because, you get 15 minutes in your, typical physician's office. Neurologists aren't exactly known for having the warmest bedside manner. And so, layered on top of all the pain that I was going through with my mom, I had this sort of revelation that I could actually create this work that I could then use as a calling card that could then get me in through the door to get to talk to researchers like Suzanne de la Monte, who had just coined type 3 diabetes at the time, to get to talk to Richard Isaacson, who was, almost single-handedly, at least from my vantage point, ushering in, the notion of and the science of dementia as a potentially preventable condition. And so that it was my first project, and it had a different name at the time, but I basically began work on this feature-length documentary, and it was impossibly difficult. We launched a Kickstarter campaign for it that went viral, and we raised about $130,000 to produce it, which was, only a fraction of ultimately what we would discover it takes to produce a documentary. But in a nutshell, it took me 10 years to finish, and my mom passed away during that time, unfortunately. But the documentary really is a tribute to her life, and it's a tribute to the science of dementia prevention, which I've seen evolve over the past 10 years to now being something that we talk about and, we might even take for granted to some degree. But this was not something that people were really talking about 10 years ago. And in it, I have some of the leading researchers in the space. And then I also have some, physicians who pre-podcasts and pre-social media who I saw it as being beacons of light in this field, not necessarily primary researchers, but physicians who were popular and who were talking about, for example, functional medicine and the like. And so, I have some of those interviews in the film as well. But the film doesn't make sweeping dietary generalizations. There's no sort of one size fits all. It's not really a diet film, even though some have labeled it as such. I think that's kind of inevitable today. What I think audiences leave the film understanding is that there really are no easy answers. It's an awful condition, and we have to think more in terms of prevention when it comes to these conditions.
Wow.
And so it's called Little Empty Boxes. It took me 10 years to make, and I'm very proud of it. And it makes me cry every time I watch it. It's about my mom and her life, and how brutal dementia can be. But ultimately, that it's not hopeless, that there is a semblance of a roadmap in terms of, how we've gotten here and how we might live to maybe go in a different direction.
Wow. And dementia is increasing, and a lot of it is preventable, we're learning, right? And so there is hope. There is something that can be done to change this, right? Investment in research, funding, there's a lot of things.
There is, but it's still really challenging. And again, there are no easy answers, and I didn't walk away with it with the sense that every dementia is preventable. I didn't walk away with the sense that dementia is reversible. I walked away from it, with hope, but also that more research needs to be done. I mean, my mom, most of the research on dementia prevention is really kind of like nonspecific dementia or Alzheimer's disease. My mom had a condition called Lewy body dementia, so there's a lot less research on that. I mean, I couldn't now. I mean, even in the year and a half since the release of my film, we're starting to understand more about the link between Parkinsonism and environmental exposures, for example. Because Lewy body dementia has more of a connection to Parkinson's disease than it does Alzheimer's disease. But there are other forms of dementia like frontotemporal dementia, and we don't have all the answers. It's just a really hard condition. And so that was a difficult balance to strike in the film. But all that is to say, I think that what's good for the brain is good for the brain. Like I don't think that we should feel a sense of fatalism about our brain health. I think, eating a dietary pattern that battens down the hatches in terms of your metabolic health, exercising regular. I mean, these are the basics. These are the big levers.
Yeah, it's all kind of related, like taking care of your body, your mind. It all is part of this. And all of the chronic diseases of today we're learning, and we think about it as the body as a system, they're often related.
Yeah.
So it really, you can't go wrong for working and prioritizing your health. I appreciate what you put out there with the movie. I'm gonna watch it. I'm inspired. And so if you haven't listened to the podcast, The Genius Life, great podcast. I was on there once. Check that out.
Great episode. Yeah.
Check out the movie. 3 books, right? Do you have 3 now?
3 books. Yeah.
3 books. So we'll leave it in the show notes. Max Lugavere, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ty. It's an honor to have been on. It's an honor to know you. I'm a huge fan, and I so appreciate everything that you've done at the policy level. So yeah, keep on trucking on. And again, just thanks so much for having me.